Okay, we're recording.
Ready to get started just yet.
Okay. So while we're working on just a few technical difficulties with our live stream this morning, so we want to welcome you to our next session of our Southeast District ANR webinar. We have an exciting topic for all outdoorsmen today. We're going to talk about growing bigger fish and all things pond. So we have with us Dave Osborne, who's going to be our a speaker today. Dave is from our Ripley County office, and as soon as I get the okay from Britt, we'll get started with the program.
We are live and ready to go.
All right, so introducing Dave, I will turn it over to you.
All right, next slide. All right, so this is a pond management. This is a program that we've done over the years. Mitch Ziske, who is our pond specialist at Purdue, put these slides together, so give him credit for that. If you see my phone number and my email, if you have any questions specific to your pond, lake system, feel free to call me at that number, send me an email. I'll be happy to talk ponds with anybody. I love to talk ponds. I love the whole area around natural resources and management. And so feel free to reach out to me. So next. All right, so here's an overview of kind of where we're going today. We're going to talk a little bit about fish biology and ecology of the primary fish in ponds in Indiana and the Midwest. We're going to look at stocking fish in your pond and when we should stock. Almost every call I get, or a very high percentage of the calls I get in the office say, well, I need you to come look at my pond and tell me what I got to stock it with. Well, probably 95% of the time, we do not need to stock a pond. We need to manage and assess the population. And most of the time, they want to throw fish in the pond because they don't have fish that are growing to the size they want. Their fish are all small. Well, throwing more fish at a pond with small fish makes the problem worse, not better. And we're going to talk about that. And then at the end, we're going to talk about managing fish through harvest. One of the only methods we have to grow fish is to manage that population. So we assess the population, see where it is based on a couple parameters. We actually have some publications that I'll share with you that you can take data and look at data and make charts and do all that, or I'll give you just kind of the quick and easy way to determine the health of your fish population. So next slide. These are two of the fish publications that the pond management group has created. One is stocking fish in Indiana ponds. The other is managing fish populations in ponds. So when we go through some of the tables and the data collection and all that material is in this managing fish populations in Indiana ponds. So if you just Google Purdue pond management, the pond management site will come up. You click on these and they're free to download. All right, next. This is also kind of an ID. Go ahead and hit it again. So here's some of the common fish we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about bluegill. Go ahead and click the button. Yeah, click bluegill and red ear sunfish. Those are two very common fish we put in the ponds. They have, as we'll see here in a minute, they have very similar biology. They are the prey species. Largemouth bass tends to be our primary predator fish, and then the catfish. The channel cat is kind of an innocent bystander. They really don't directly compete with bluegill or bass. They feed on some of the stuff that's still left in there. So putting channel catfish in a pond doesn't really hurt the growth potential of the other species in the pond, and they kind of are an innocent bystander. All right. So then we're going to look at bluegill biology. They mainly eat insects, snails, small crawfish, fish eggs. They are the primary food in our pond systems for our largemouth bass. Once we stock bluegill in the second season, they will start spawning. They spawn in the summer. Their beds are grouped together. Okay, that shows you kind of what a bluegill bed looks like. If you're looking at your pond and you don't find about 3 or 4 of these per acre that look like a honeycomb, look like a beehive, and you only see single or 2 or 3 of these together, what you probably have is a very limited nesting structure. And we'll talk a little bit about how we put in some of that structure here in a few minutes. The females can produce 50,000 eggs per female, and bluegill can very easily overpopulate a pond. Most of the time, if you're catching a bunch of bluegill that are all the same size, they're all about the size you see in this picture, then you probably have a population that's overpopulated and stunted. A good growing pond, it says here 6 years, it can actually grow to 10 inches in a really good pond in 4 to 5 years, if we keep our numbers right. Okay, next slide. So red ear, very similar diets to bluegill, except for they really like to focus on snails. So if you've got an existing pond that has some of the diseases like white spot and black spot, which are grubs, part of that life cycle of that parasite is the snail. And so if we put red ear in there and they eat a bunch of those snails, they can greatly reduce that parasite load. They're similarly food for largemouth bass. They typically don't spawn as soon as bluegill. They spawn generally in the 2nd or 3rd season. They can spawn right where the bluegill spawn. You'll see a red ear bed right next to a bluegill bed. But they have a growth potential of a little bit bigger. They can grow about, a half a pound to 3/4 of a pound bigger than a bluegill. So, all right. So largemouth biology, they're the major predator in most of our farm ponds. They eat bluegills, crayfish, minnows. They'll eat other bass. They'll typically eat anything they can get in their mouth and swallow. A bass tends to spawn after about 3 years of age. They're going to spring spawn. So about April in most of our ponds, you'll see the bass starting to come in. They make a solitary bed. The male guard the fry for about 7 to 10 days. And in a good managed pond, largemouth bass can grow up to 10 pounds here in the Midwest. So they may, channel catfish, they eat insects, crayfish. They are kind of our garbage collectors. They eat a lot of dead fish. They can reach over 20 pounds, 20 to 30 pounds in the Midwest farm ponds. They tend to spawn in June and July when the water temperature gets above 75 degrees. Most of our ponds do not have adequate spawning sites for channel cats. So they typically do not spawn in our local ponds unless we put structures in place, a hollow log, we'll see here in a minute, a catfish box or something for them to actually spawn, because they do not guard their nest. So as soon as they lay their eggs, if those eggs silt over, they suffocate and they don't hatch. You'll know you had successful catfish spawn is if you see sometime in July and August, a real black, almost like a basketball sized school of fry swimming around the edge of the pond. And you'll know you actually had some channel cat that actually successfully spawned. Bass love small catfish. They're just another prey item that we can help our bass grow if we put channel cat in. So. Go ahead next. All right, fish habitat. So I talked a little bit about structure. If we're not seeing fish nesting starting in April, May, we're not finding bass on the nest, but we know we have bass in there. If we're not finding that kind of things, then we may need to add structure. A lot of our old ponds, and when I say old ponds, I'm talking 15, 20, 30 years. A lot of the muck on the side that has gotten so thick from the bank sloughing off and different things that a bluegill or a bass cannot actually open a nest up to a gravelly or a hard substrate. And they really need a hard gravel type substrate to successfully lay their eggs. So you see a bass box, bass nesting box there. You see a catfish barrel. A catfish barrel or an old milk jug with gravel in the bottom protects those eggs from silting in because there's a cover on the top. What my suggestion is, you put those in with a rope on them so that when you see a couple clouds of young channel cat fry in your pond or lake, you can pull that nesting structure out for a couple years, because you do not need 10 channel cat in a 1 acre lake reproducing every year. So I like the catfish structure to be put in about every 2 or 3 years. As soon as you see some fry in that lake, you know they were successful, pull it out, let it be out for another couple years, and that's how you can stock your catfish, is put that nesting structure in and out. You see brush piles, we can put brush piles in place for structure to help habitat. One of the easiest times to do that is actually when you've got enough ice on the pond that you can get out there and build the brush pile. Then that brush pile can actually just sink in place once the ice melts. And we can put in stake beds. It's called the old pickle barrel method, where you pour concrete in a bucket, you put stakes, or you put cedar trees or hardwoods like locusts and things like that in those, and you drop those down, and the weight of the concrete in the bucket buries those. But most of our ponds in Southeast Indiana, in the Midwest, were built for livestock watering. They were not built for habitat. So a lot of them are just like a cereal bowl with very little cover or habitat in them. So a lot of times, if we want to help fish grow, help them reach their potential, we need some cover like that. Some other fish we can stock, and some other questions I get, fathead minnows, as well as golden shiners. Both of those are really good forage for largemouth bass. It's a good idea if you're building a pond and you haven't got any fish in there, the first fish you should stock in the spring, and the pond doesn't even need to be more than about a quarter of the way full, is you want to stock some fathead minnows. You want to get a minnow species started in the pond. The two that I suggest, especially in Indiana and the Midwest, are fathead minnows and golden shiners. Those are the two. Grass carp, if you have some problems with some pond weeds, rooted type pond weeds, things like that, grass carp can do a good job for you, or part of a management plan for weed management. And they can be put in there at about 6 to 8 fish per acre is a good stocking rate. We're not going to talk a lot about weeds this time, but they do a pretty decent job with our rooted weeds, but you need to actually order those through a licensed hatchery. And then tilapia, I've done some tilapia work the last 3 or 4 years in local ponds. They're very good to control algae. They'll eat duckweed, they'll eat some pond weeds and things like that. The negative about tilapia is you can't put them in until the water temperature hits about 65 degrees. And as soon as the water temperature gets down in the 50s in the fall in Indiana, they're going to die. They get real sluggish. They are one of the weed
Dave or Britt, are we still on?
I think Dave is frozen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if Dave can hear us. He may want to stop his video, of course, keeping the audio on. But if he comes back on, maybe that'll help with his connection problem.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Dave to rejoin us, do you have any questions out there? If you do, just feel free to put those in the chat box, or you can unmute and we can write those down for Dave. He's trying to reconnect to us. Hey, Dave. So Brett Dave is trying to reconnect with his phone. I think their internet crashed at their office.
Ooh, okay.
So would anybody like to unmute and just kind of describe maybe what your pond situation is? Is it a farm pond? Is it a lake? Do you use it for recreational? What is it? Is it something that the just the grandkids may use, or the kids? If you just want to kind of talk about what situation you have at home. Anybody would like to do that?
Hello, hello.
Go ahead, Terry, you're fine.
I just had a pond put in last year, 1 acre pond. I have a little island in the middle of it. I plan on putting some ducks out there. But this has been very useful because I've already met with Jones Fishery on stocking, and they said I could put the minnows in ahead of the other fish or together. And I was kind of wondering if you all thought there was a preference one way or the other. But yeah, this has all been very good information.
Okay, I'm back, I think.
All right. So Terry, if you don't mind, when at the very end, if you'll ask that question, we'd certainly appreciate that of Dave.
Oh, sure.
All right.
I just had a new pond put in last spring. It's just now filling up because of the drought, but it's a 1 acre pond. And I've met with Jones Fishery to stock it. I haven't stocked it just yet. They mentioned putting in the minnows ahead of the other fish or putting them in together. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are, if you have a preference.
Yeah, I really think you can put those in early before it fills up. As long as you've got some water in there, the minnows will do fine. And as far as the stocking, we're going to cover some numbers here in a minute of other
Dave,
fish. So, yep.
I think we're ready to go. If you want us to go to the next slide, we
I'll
can.
go to the next slide. Okay. So some of the fish that can be problems that we really don't want to put in there. We do not want bullheads. One of the ways bullheads get into ponds is people go to a creek or something and sing their own minnows. They get a couple bullhead minnows or bullhead in there. They dump the minnows when they're done fishing, and they can add things like common carp, as you see at the bottom, bullheads, perch and crappie. If you really like perch and crappie, you can stock them into a pond. But what you need to realize is crappie will overpopulate a pond very quickly. So if you're going to put crappie in there, as soon as they get big enough to eat, you're going to want to keep every crappie you catch, because if you don't, you're going to have thousands of crappie, but they're all going to be 4 or 5 inches long. So next. Okay. So in most situations, we really only want to stock new ponds or a pond that we've completely renovated. We want an empty environment. We want to start with balanced populations, and we want to stock small fish. Well, again, most of the calls I get, people want me to come look at their pond and tell them what they need to stock. But most of the time, they have way too many fish in there, and they think throwing fish in there will make the fish they throw in there grow better, and they're just adding to the problem. So we'll look here a little bit about some numbers and talk about population management on the next couple of slides. So next. So when we're stocking fish, we want to get fish from a reputable dealer, someone that's raising those, that's licensed. We want to stock in the cool times of the year, so we want to stock in that late February, early March time of year is probably the best. We're moving fish in a very cool time. We do not want the temperatures to get much above 70 degrees while we're moving fish. We want to acclimate those fish. So the bags on the left, you see those bags is how fish come. We want to make sure if we're buying fish at the soil and water, meaning that when we get them to the pond, we're putting those bags little by little in the pond water so that the water gets to be the same temperature. And then we release them. If we just take those bags down and pour them in the pond, and the water in the bag 65 degrees and the water in the pond's 50 degrees, we're going to shock and kill most of those fish. So The other part of that is people want to ask, can I go to my brother's pond and catch fish and move fish myself? The answer to that, can I, is yes. The answer, should I don't know what the health of those fish are. I don't know if they have parasites, if they have disease, if they're stunted, or any of that information. So if I put stunted fish into a new pond, it will not create a situation where those fish become unstunted. And stunted fish, when they start to reproduce and nest, have smaller fry with smaller structures and slower growth rate. So what we can actually do is we can put fish into a new pond situation that are behind the 8 ball as far as growth and health from the very get-go. So it's recommended that we don't do that. I know people do. I know people have had some success with that. But you really got to be careful doing that. If you made all the investment of putting the pond or building the pond or renovating the pond, it's not that much more of an investment to put the right kind of fish in there. Okay. So let's look at a basic stocking rate. This is per acre. A good stocking rate is bluegill about 1,000 per acre and largemouth about 200 per acre. And you see those are fingerlings, 1 to 3 inches in size. I know some people want to get a jump on bass, so they'll pay a little more for a 6 to 7 inch bass, and they throw in bluegill at 1 inch. Well, what you've done is you've put predators in the pond that are hungry looking for food, and they're eating your 1 inch bluegill you just paid for. So you want these two to kind of grow up together, and you want them to eat some of them, but you don't want them to eat them before they actually get old enough to start helping you with your population. If you want to put red ear in, you can split that treatment. 500 red ear, 500 bluegill is a good idea. Channel cat, if you like catfish, if you like to watch kids catch big animals and have their pole really bent, catfish are fun to have in a pond. And again, they don't really negatively impact a pond. They kind of go along for the ride. So if you match those, about 200 of those. And then, like I said, if you put in nest structures and successfully have them reproduce, you don't have to stock them again. If you don't do that, you can stock about another 50 channel cats about every 3 or 4 years. Okay. Subsequent stocking, here you see, if you come back, you're going to stock a little bit bigger fish, which means they're a little more expensive, but very seldom is that required. Well, if we get a pond off and running well, very seldom do we need to restock fish, but you still see that 5-to-1 ratio. We try to keep that 5-to-1 ratio intact. All right. So fish growth in ponds, how fast will fish grow? And this is an average, and some of this is from a little bit more in the north part of the Midwest. Here in southeast Indiana and southern Indiana, bluegill will grow to about 10 inches, in 8 to 10 inches in about 4 to 5 years. You see here, this is 5 to 6. Bass will grow up to that 16, 18 inch in about 5 years. Channel cat will generally follow the bass growth. They're almost mirror bass growth. So an 18-inch bass in most of our farm ponds around here is somewhere in that 3 to 4 pound range. So here is a couple ways to do fish assessments. The one publication I told you has this little chart in there. It has a page you can make copies. So when you catch a fish, you put the date, you put what size it was, and you keep data that way, so that you can look back at that data at the end of the year. You can kind of assess where your fish are based on some of the ratios we'll see here in a minute. We're not going to go real deep into those ratios because we actually have a workshop that's 3 hours that we go real in depth into that data. But you can keep those ratios and you can look at your fish and say, okay, my fish are doing well. My bluegill, I need to keep more of. My bass, I keep more of. And we'll look at a couple of those scenarios. You can take a big seine. You can net a fish and get a sample of your fish population. And you can use that to determine the health of your fish. That tends to work really good in smaller bodies of water. And then the electrofishing. You can have a lake survey done. You can have a person with an electro boat come in. They'll keep the data, and then they'll give you a report that your bass are a little small for average. Your bluegill are really good size. They'll give you a report, and then they'll give you a recommendation of what you should keep, how much you should harvest based on your goals. Next page. So two keys to fish growth is basically we're looking at relative weight. What is that fish in my pond? What is the weight of that fish compared to what a normal fish should be at that size? So relative weight means if I catch an 8-inch bluegill and I weigh it and it weighs 3/4 of a pound, we'll look at a chart here in a minute, and that's right on track. And I know the management that I'm doing in my pond is right on track with the average pond, around the Midwest. The other of that is proportional size distribution. So what is the size of my fish compared to what a normal is? And if it's less than 100%, that means my fish are a little smaller than norm. If it's a greater than 100%, then my fish are really, really doing well. So that's one of the parameters, and it's very well explained and spelled out how we do that with the publication. And I saw Britt shared that in the chat. So next page. So you can see relative weight is if we catch a 14-inch bass, that bass should weigh 1.5 pounds. But say in our pond, we caught it and we put it on a scale and it weighed 2 pounds. Our bass would be doing really, really well. They're rarely healthy. They're really putting on the weight. But if that same bass at 14 inches only weighed a pound, then we would know, hey, my bass are probably not doing as well as they need to. So the two things that would tell you is if they weigh a pound, that you probably have too many bass and not enough forage, not enough food. So you got to take some mouths out of the pond. You got to harvest some more of those bass so that the bass can kind of get up to where they really need to be, up to where that average is. In a pond situation where those bass are 2 pounds, you may not need to do anything because that's probably where you want to be. Most people like the bass to grow very well, like bigger bass. But it also means you could probably hold off some of the bass harvest and let a few more bass grow. And we'll see some scenarios here, and we'll get into that. But that's kind of what this relative weight means, or calculating relative weight. Okay.
Just Dave, you're just a little soft on your audio. I don't know if you're having to turn your mic up just a little bit.
Well, I'm on my phone now, so.
Oh, okay.
Is that better?
That's a little better, yes.
All right. The other is proportional size distribution. So we can look at bluegill and bass and sunfish, and we can see, okay, what size are they, and what size are they compared to a well-balanced pond? What size are they if I decide that I want a pond to be a growing big bass pond? And so we'll have a couple scenarios here in a minute where we'll look at some different goals and goals we set for the pond, and what some of this proportional size distribution means to helping us achieve those goals. All right, next. All right. So if I have a low relative weight, it indicates that the fish growth is suboptimal. It could be low from low productivity. It could be from low food, most likely due to too much competition. We just have too many fish and we're crowded. If I have low proportional side density, it indicates that the fish population is actually stunted. And that stunted fish population throws us quite a bit of problems. But all these ponds, even if we have some stunted fish, we can get that pond to grow out of that stunning situation by population management. So we really can solve these problems with harvest, and we'll look at that here in the next couple slides. So you can see, go ahead to the next one. We don't really need to. All right, so we're going to look at a couple scenarios here. The first one is But some people just want a catfish fishery. They just love to catch catfish. Well, all they really need to do is continually stock catfish at about 100 to 200 a year, and keep about 30 of those fish every year, 15 to 20 inches. So that's the harvest. If you just have a catfish pond, you're going to try to harvest about 30 of those 15 to 20 inch fish, which means you're going to harvest somewhere around 100 pounds of catfish a year. So let's look at the all-purpose. And most people want their ponds to be kind of an all-purpose fishery. You know, decent-sized bass, good-sized bluegill. And so you're going to look at that, and you're going to harvest about 300 bluegill every year per acre. That's a per acre harvest. My rule of thumb is even a little heavier than that. I like to see people harvest about 500 per acre, because I don't think we can ever over harvest bluegill in the ponds that I've visited. So a lot of people will say, well, there's no way I keep even close to 300. The other side of that is the bass. What we want to do in an all-purpose, the bass we want to keep about 15 to 20 pounds of bass a year. And that's in a well-managed lake. That's in an all-purpose lake that already has a good, even population. And one of the other ways you can do a population, and we saw these other two, and you can use that publication and keep your records. But a good rule of thumb is if you go out and catch a dozen bluegill and a dozen bass, and in those dozen bluegill, you can see 3 to 4 different size classes. In other words, you have a couple that are 9 inches. You have 3 or 4 that are 7 or 8 inches. You have a couple that are 6 inches, and maybe you caught one that's 3 inches. That's 4 size classes. If you have 4 size classes of bluegill in a farm pond, you have a farm pond that's in pretty good shape. If you have 3 size classes of bass, in other words, you caught one bass that was 3.5 pounds, you caught 2 or 3 bass that were 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds, and you caught 5 or 6 that were 1 pound. That's 3 size classes. And that distribution of bass would tell you that your bass are doing pretty well. Now, we'll look here in a minute. We'll talk a little bit about, so what if I want my bass to be bigger? Let's go to the next slide. So this is a scenario. If you reach out to Kyle or Britt, they have this slide presentation. They can share this with you. I don't care if it goes out. But this is several different scenarios, and so it tells you that if you're catching this and you're catching that, what do you do? So let's look at the first scenario. So if your bass mostly are less than 12 inches, and all the bluegill you catch are mostly more than 5 inches, and you want an all-purpose fishery, that all-purpose lake, it tells you that you need to harvest largemouth bass less than 12 inches and do not harvest any bluegills. The bluegills are not in a position to be harvested. If that's the scenario, but you want to achieve large bluegills, you follow the large bluegill management in that publication, option 3 on 4, which would tell you that you're going to do a little bit more, maybe supplemental feeding. The bluegill aren't growing to where you really need them to grow to. You're going to harvest some of the smaller bluegill and leave the bigger bluegill. And so it gives you kind of the guidelines if you want to achieve large bluegills. The only way to achieve large bluegills in a farm pond situation is to reduce the numbers. You gotta let those bigger bluegill grow more by taking the smaller bluegill out of the situation and maintaining the big bluegill. The other thing that does is those big bluegill are better nesters than those smaller bluegill. But if you wanted to achieve a trophy largemouth option, you're going to harvest the bass less than 12 inches so that those bigger bass have more forage and can grow faster. And you're going to harvest, you can harvest bluegills at that 300 an acre level that we want to, because, as long as you've got good bluegill nesting habitat, you're always going to have small bluegills for those bass to eat. But you want to So to grow large fish, bass or bluegill, we take out some of the smaller fish and we have less mouths to feed, so that the growth potential in that pond is going on fewer fish and they grow more. So let's look at the very bottom scenario. So if you're catching bass and they're mostly less than 12 inches, and you're catching bluegill and they're mostly less than 5 inches, okay, you want to increase the harvest of bluegills, but not necessarily the bass, because those smaller bass are going to help you eat the smaller bluegills, but those smaller bass are not going to be able to take a 5 or 6 or 7 inch bluegill. And so you're trying to take those bluegill mouths out of there. Let those bass also take some of the smaller to kind of bring the populations back into balance. If you wanted big bluegills and you're only catching the small ones, you want to harvest and keep every bluegill under 6 inches. And it may mean you need to catch 4,000 or 5,000 bluegill out of that pond a year for 3 or 4 years until you start getting bluegill over 6 inches. And until you get that where you can catch 12 fish and have 3 or 4 size classes, you're just going to keep harvesting every bluegill under 6 inches. You're not going to throw any of those back. We see if we have a pond situation like that, which this bottom one is kind of a stunted pond, and I see a lot of these stunted ponds. If you want large bass, you're going to keep every bass you can under 12 inches, just to take the mouths out of there to try to get those bass to grow more efficiently for you. Okay, so that chart's fairly involved. That chart is in that publication too. So I'll open it up for questions, and I've got 1 or 2 more topics, so I'll talk about if we don't have many questions, but let's have questions.
So if you have any questions for Dave, you can unmute or you can put those in the chat box for us.
Are we not hearing any questions?
I don't hear any questions, Dave. So if you want to continue on.
Well, let me. I think that's my last slide.
Yep.
Yeah. So let me talk about 1 or 2 other items. So if you've got a new pond and you're going to invest in fish growth and you want your fish to grow and be protected, one of the best things you can do for that pond is aeration. Aeration is your insurance policy. Most of our fish kills come from lack of oxygen, either in a winter situation, a lack of oxygen, or you'll hear people say my pond turned over, things like that. Well, that turnover really is just a mixing of unoxygenated water with the life zone of the water. And so aeration is the key. So if you're going to invest in building a lake and you're building it mainly for a fishery, and to have a fishery, part of that investment ought to include aeration. And a typical rule of thumb is you size that aeration so that the water is stirred by that aeration or by the diffusing bubbles once every 24 hours. And typically, a kind of a rule of thumb is a 0.5 horsepower per acre in your aerator. So if you're going to do aeration, you're probably going to want to get hold of a company. You heard Jones mentioned earlier in the talk. Aquatic Control does that. There are 2 or 3 companies around that do aeration, but you really probably want someone to come out and look at a pond or lake. Now, I get the question: do all ponds and lakes need aeration? If you've got a pond that's 2 acres or bigger, and you've got 15 to 16 foot of depth in that pond, that's a pond that's pretty safe. Year in and year out, that pond's probably not going to have problems from a fish kill, unless you have something run off like manure that causes a real huge algae bloom, and then that algae all dies at once and takes the oxygen out of the water. So depth and size are your friends. So if you're going to build a lake and you can build one 2.5 acres, or you can, and you can build it 16-foot depth, do that. That lake's going to be much more productive than an 1.5 acre lake that's at 12 foot of depth, because you simply have more acre feet of water, you have more habitat, and you have more growth potential. Every pond only has a certain amount of growth potential. And when that growth potential is realized, if you've got 10,000 bluegill on the growth potential of a pond versus 2,000, every fish in that 2,000 gets 20% more energy out of that pond situation. So pond management in a nutshell is all a numbers game. So we've got to reduce the number of mouths if we want to get bigger fish. Did I hear somebody?
So if you have any questions for Dave, you can unmute or put those in the chat box.
Again, if you want to talk in person or individually, feel free to reach out and give me a call.
Hey, Dave, this is Tom. I was just going to say that when you're getting reconnected with your phone and Terry was asking the question there about stocking the fish, she also described her 1 acre pond as having a small island in the middle for ducks, ducks or geese, I guess, which I think is kind of cool. But any other things to note about that, or just know that maybe making it a little bit more shallow with having
that's the whole key. You're increasing the number of feet in an acre pond of the shallow interface between the bank and the deeper water, which what that does in general is it increases the interface where plant growth is going to occur. So that, I mean, not that it automatically makes it worse from a weedy situation, but that's what you're dealing with. And as long as you realize that you're kind of increasing that potential, and a lot of people say that's fine. So yeah, I mean, what you may find though is inviting ducks and geese on the forefront kind of seems like a neat deal. I like to watch ducks and geese. I like to watch wildlife. The flip side of that is ducks and geese bring you a couple problems. They bring you a whole bunch of nutrient inputs into that pond that can grow algae. And the fact that they're going out and feeding and they're bringing that back and they're leaving it in your pond. The other thing is they're landing in ponds that have things like duckweed and water meal. They're eating some of the seeds off of some of the rooted plants and some of the mosses, and they come back and they go through that duck system, and some of the seed germinates and becomes a weed issue, or the water meal or duckweed falls off their feathers when they land in your water, and now you've started watermeal and duckweed. So attracting waterfowl is great if that's one of your goals, but it can also throw you some curves from a weed management perspective.
Yeah, so great. That's where I was going with it though, and appreciate that. And again, not to dampen Terry's, just having this new pond built and have that there, but still, I guess just to make aware of that may be some of the problems that would be happening down the road.
Yeah, if you're starting with a new pond and you see some issues, getting on those early and not letting them get out of control is a key to maintaining the ability to manage those fairly easily.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to get ducks was, they're cool, but I thought they would manage the duckweed, but I really didn't think about them going to other ponds. Right now their wings are clipped, so they're not going anywhere. But yeah, I hadn't really considered that. I thought they would be good for managing the duckweed and any other weeds that it might pop up that I don't really necessarily want.
Yeah, most of the ducks and things, they'll ingest a little bit of duckweed and stuff like that, but that's really not part of their diet. What they're actually doing in there is they're they're dabbling through that duckweed and stuff to get little zooplankton, little, I don't know if any of you ever in your life bought the sea monkeys. You know, they're little organisms. They're little like grass shrimp and things like that. There are a lot of insect larvae and stuff like that that hang out in the duckweed. So a duck or a set of ducks and all that aren't really going to help you control duckweed. They'll feed around it and they'll ingest a little bit of it. But yeah, I mean, if they're cool and that's your goal, I tell everybody your pond is yours. And if you say I want to put crappie in there because you like to eat and catch crappie more than any other fish in the world, then you should put crappie in your pond because that's why you built it. But then I'll share with you some of the management strategies so they just don't get out of control. So yeah, the ducks are going to be there if you're not talking about wild ducks, but what your ducks will do is your ducks will attract wild ducks because they think they're going to be their buddies. So having live ducks on a pond, typically you attract other ducks to your pond just because they see ducks there. So
when you said attract wildlife, I thought you meant coyotes, and I've already seen those on my trail cam, so I know they're there. So I probably might not have too many ducks when all is said and done. I'm not sure.
yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that coyotes will swim after ducks. Most of the time, if a duck can get in the water, they're pretty safe. So they'll be pretty safe on that island because they can hear or see a coyote coming through the water. So it gives them an escape route more so than if they were just on the bank. So it definitely creates a safety place for them more than if they just were walking around a bank. So
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Dave? Give you